I'm going to do a brief presentation on what's called meta-perspective. And what actually precipitated me to do this, a few months ago, Najib sent me a draft article he was working on. And he says, you know, we need some more rigor in different areas. So the paper that he was working on with Thomas and Jeremy, I looked at it kind of closely, and it's a wide open field, and there's a lot of different topics that can be addressed in what's appearing in their paper. So I just looked at one, clarity of cross-disciplinary communications. And those of you that were here yesterday, one thing on providing clarity, a possibility is hyperscanning. But there's other possibilities too. And one of those possibilities is taking a look at the affective domain during communications between disciplinarians within interdisciplinary teams. Transdisciplinary teams. This is just an example of some of the team members that might be on it. It's wide open. I've seen in my travels lots of different domains coming together to actually do different types of innovations. Key to everything is the semiotic systems. Each domain and discipline of expertise has its own disciplinary semiotic system. Now, there was a professor, Louis Hebert, and he said basically that the field of study is concerned with signs and or signification. In other words, it's the process of creating meaning within those disciplines. Now, as a domain's knowledge base evolves, a bias unique to the discipline is established over time. It's reflecting how the knowledge base was formed, the unique agreed upon meetings of existing concepts, and generation of additional concepts, symbols, and relationships. In other words, each unique domain actually forms a specific philosophy for that domain. And when you're communicating across different domains, especially in interdisciplinary teams, that philosophy becomes key, because the philosophy underneath kind of drives the attitude, belief, and value system. Attaining common ground, that's probably the most difficult thing in an interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary team. Every team that I've ever been a part of or formed, there's that getting to know one another phase to where the vocabularies need to be shared and a common understanding has to be attained. If you don't have that, your team's not going to function quite well. Now, the establishment of those common grounds are translations between the disciplinary semiotic systems of the unique disciplines involved. And that translation process can take a short amount of time, a long amount of time. Sometimes it never really does happen. And it results in very poor innovations. Now, effective communications between disciplinarians representing their respective disciplines, again, is so very key. But how do we actually add rigor to measure that? How do we know if the communications were effective? And yesterday, again, I made a presentation on hyperscanning. That's just one possible way of doing it. Communication process itself can be fraught with misunderstandings. And the misunderstandings are basically formed because of the result of the communication processes that's being used. And what I mean by that, sometimes written communication is more effective than verbal communications. Sometimes it's the reverse. It's just the context of the situation and the complexities involved in what you're trying to create in an innovative process. Misunderstandings and epiphanies. I touched on this a couple of times this week. The misunderstanding, the failure to understand something properly, For example, a situation or a person's remarks. Usually a lack of knowledge, lack of context. The epiphany, a moment of sudden revelation or insight, discovery of knowledge, discovery of context. In that communication process, at the very beginning, miscommunication and misunderstanding usually occurs. But as it goes on and on, all of a sudden, you'll see people having epiphanies. And that's, I understand what they say. And oh, by the way, this is how we can use it in this type of innovation environment. That's very important, the misunderstandings and the epiphanies. But then again, how do you measure that? How do you actually put rigor to it? In the communication process itself, you have a sender and a receiver. And perception is attained between the sender and receiver if there's a coupling between the ongoing neuroactivities in each of their brains. So I want to take a look, and when I thought about the article that I read, something novel, and something that's not really being addressed explicitly, and that's the attitude, belief, and value systems of the people involved, and it's towards the concepts and objects in their domain. I've really seen nobody addressing that formally, and I think we need to do that. So metaperspective. Metaperspective is when the sender knows for sure that the receiver understands what they're communicating. In other words, if I come up and say race car and we start discussing race cars, I'll know if you understand what a race car is. But it's key for me as a sender to get the feedback or the proper feedback that there's understanding going on. But I want to look at it in a unique way, and that's the attitude, belief, and value systems about the concept being discussed. So metaperspective, knowing that the other person realizes what I'm talking about. 30 years ago, when I was an undergraduate, I was studying cross-cultural communications. And I had one of the world's leading experts, a lady by the name of Wei-Sin Young, as my advisor. And she was teaching me how to come up with very simplistic ways of measuring things, and especially in a communication context. And she said, maybe we need something to measure attitude, belief, and value systems. So from the work of Martin Fishbein's Measuring Beliefs as Applied to Attitudes, and on the work of Milton Rokish's utilization of attitude, belief, and values to measure change of a person's behavior and self-regard, I come up with a brand new base algorithm. And I have it up there, and it's where P0 is the person's perspective of concept 0. It could be an object, could be a concept, could even be a term. Now, attitude in this context is defined as a predisposition to act in a positive or negative way towards the concept. In other words, if I see something like computer memory, and computer memory is very dear to me, and I have a very positive thing to it. My wife could care less about computers, so she has a very negative attitude towards computer memory. The belief, it's the person's belief that the attitude towards the concept is true. And belief systems are very powerful, even in a theologic way, when you look at the differences in different cultures on theologic type attitudes towards object. It's very different. Values, the person's degree of importance placed on the concept. Do you value, say, the importance of memory? I do. Memory in a computer system. My wife does not. So her value of computer memory is not very good. So I had to expand and modify the algorithm a little bit. And what I did was put the sender's perspective on one side of an equation and a receiver's perspective on the other side. And X, we can actually say that that's the sender's discipline. Could be mathematics. Y over here, it could be another domain, cognitive science. But the key is, how do we get a measurement for attitude, belief, and value systems so we can compare between the two? And I did a simple sum of attitude, beliefs, and values and compared it from one side of the equation, from the sender's perspective to the receiver's perspective. So how do you acquire the data? Well, that took me about a week to figure out as an undergrad, and finally I came to the conclusion, just do a series of Likert scale questions on attitudes, beliefs, and values about a concept or an object or a term. Seems pretty simple, and it was. So in the beginning of discourse, what you can expect sometimes is the sender's attitude, belief, and value sum might be, say, 12. The receiver's 0. In other words, there's no attitude, belief, and value systems that's shared. The affective domain, it's really not merging together. However, through discourse, you might come up with a perfect score. Attitude, belief, and value systems, say on a concept, say computer memory, might be 12 for the sender, might be 12 for the receiver after that discourse. That rarely happens. And even though I've tried to teach my wife computers over the years, her score for computer memory is 0 still. So here's what's going to happen sometimes. You might do measurements over a series of weeks on an interdisciplinary team. And again, you might start off with, oh, the equation's not equaling. Week 2, give them the same set of questions. All of a sudden, the receiver might start saying, hey, wait a minute, this is starting to make sense to me. I'm starting to change my attitude, belief, and value system towards it. Week 3, it may get closer. Week 4, it may get closer. But notice, it never gets equal. Rarely will it get equal. Our attitude, belief, and value systems are that different. But it should come within a certain range. Now let's take a look at the example I gave earlier of who might be involved in an interdisciplinary team. Might be a mathematics person, might be a neuroscience person. And after discourse, you do that post-measurement. For mathematics, the attitude, belief, and value system for a concept might be 12, and for the receiver, say in neuroscience, it might be 8. It's not equal, but it's within a range. Question is, what's an acceptable range? And I'll get into why that's important in a moment. Metaperspective. You can do that across the entire team. The sender, the person speaking, might be the mathematics guy, and all these other folks from neuroscience, cognitive science, computer science, philosophy, for a concept being discussed, you might have different results. You might have a sum total of 8 or 9 or 11 or a 10. Not exactly what the mathematician attitude, belief, and value system is towards an object, but close. At times, you're going to come up with situations like this. Mathematics, well, okay, it's 12. Neuroscience, cognitive science, computer science, but the philosophy team member. Towards an object, the attitude, belief, and value system is just a 2. So that's definitely not equal, and it's probably not within an acceptable range. So what can be done to actually improve a communication process to get that attitude, belief, and value system up into an acceptable range? And that's future work, and I'll get to that in a moment. Other uses for this. I don't know if it's even feasible to implement this for inter and transdisciplinary teams. What I do know for a fact, because I've done it before, is to implement it in learning, education, and training situations. There's a lot of times where we don't even consider attitude, belief, and value systems when we teach. We don't even consider the affective domain. And the affective domain is kind of critical because the attitude, belief, and value system is harmonized between an instructor and a student. There's a good likelihood, because they have that shared affective domain perspective on a concept, you can grow knowledge in that student a lot better than before. Again, a lot of times, it's never going to be equal, but there'll be an acceptable range. And key is determining what that acceptable range is. Okay, meta-perspective research questions. Can a meta-perspective measuring attitude, belief, and value systems between people, is it possible on inter and transdisciplinary teams? I don't know. I don't think it's ever been done before. I don't even think that the meta-perspective formula I came up with 30 years ago has ever been implemented for inter and transdisciplinary teams. What are the range of acceptable equivalencies? Is this an acceptable range? 12 and 9? I don't know. A teacher or an instructor would probably know the answer to that right away. But what makes it more complex is if you apply this to inter and interdisciplinary teams, to where you have all these other disciplines involved. In other words, between mathematics and neuroscience for a concept, is there an acceptable range for that concept? Same with mathematics and cognitive science. Is there an acceptable range for that? And oh, by the way, what is that range? If we do some research studies, over time, we'll start discovering what those acceptable ranges are. Now, are there patterns of equivalency ranges between disciplines? In other words, in certain situations or the context of the situation, you know that word context, I've heard it a lot this week, and those who don't know me, context is definitely everything, especially not only here but in artificial intelligence. But are there patterns? And underneath, what's the context of those patterns? In other words, what were they discussing? What communication modes were they using? Exactly what was being said? Those are the different kinds of contexts, and that's going to rely heavily on natural language processing. And once you actually process the communications, finding the patterns, that's another thing that you have to do. And what I'm trying to get at is this is very open to utilizing artificial intelligence techniques to find those patterns and even discover what the contexts are. Because as a research, sometimes we don't know what those contexts are. But through pattern analysis on, say, big data, if you have a big data store of the information, you can actually start finding out. Attitude, belief, and value systems, before I close. In an artificial intelligence context, is there a way to measure what could be considered an affective domain in an artificial intelligence entity and a human? I can tell you through my experiments that an AI entity can understand what an attitude, belief, and value system is, but nowhere near in a way that a human does. A human has that affective domain feelings about the thought. Whenever I talk about brain-computer interfaces, that's one of my loves, I get this tingly feeling. A computer will never get that. An AI entity will never get that. But is there a way to set up just through understanding of an AI entity on what an attitude, belief, and value system is, to actually apply a formula such as this, to find out if we can gain a meta-perspective. I don't know. Future research area. Now, I know this seems very simplistic, it is. But the reason I think Najib wanted me to present on this is something that's very simplistic. And I've learned early on, it's very easy to be complex, but it's very difficult to be simplistic. And since I have mentors like Najib and Wei-Sin Young, I've learned that, yeah, take some extra time. Make it very simplistic. Even the hyperscanning, once you study it, might seem complex at first, but actually it's pretty simplistic. And I think that's all my slides. Thank you. I appreciate it.